Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good today. So today's webinar, we're going to talk about some JavaScript and .NET code upgrade best practices if you're moving from the CRM 4.0 object model up to the CRM 2011 plus object model. So that's what we're going to cover today. So my name is Mitch Milam. I think everybody should know that by now. I'm a Dynamics CRM architect and independent consultant. A 10-time MVP for Dynamics CRM. They're now calling that Business Solutions, by the way. You can contact me at Mitch at External Coaches or infinite-x.net is my main blog right now, and of course I'm on Twitter. So we're recording this, so it'll be up on YouTube. It's probably going to be Monday before it gets up on YouTube, but I'll send everybody a link out when I get through with it. A little bit of housekeeping. We'll have some Q&A here at the end, and if you want to raise your hand to talk, just use the raise your hand icon, number B there. And then, of course, you can put questions in the question box there, of course, as always. So future events we got coming up. In 2 weeks, we got a CRM developer bootcamp. So this is to turn a .NET developer into a dynamic CRM developer. And then starting on June 21st is understanding dynamic CRM workflow processes. So that's a new thing I came up with for workflows and dialogues and things like that. That's actually an interesting course. It's over 5 weeks. We meet once a week for 2 hours a week, and so it's like a 5-week course. So it should be kind of interesting there. So if you want to know more information about either one of those, just visit those pages or just send me an email and I'll drop your reply as soon as I can. The webinars in June are probably going to be on the 17th and the 24th. I haven't figured out exactly the topics yet, but almost got it ready. So I'll probably email those out next week when I get back in town. So as always, externalcoaches.com/webinars has the upcoming webinars and the recordings of everything else we've done. And I guess it's always on my YouTube channel. Sign up for knowledge bits if you haven't. So those are just email deliveries daily to give you some tips and tricks that I've learned. I've got some learning plans out at the free stuff link. And then I'm going to be finished with my plugin development and administration books here in a couple weeks, and security shortly after that. So those are coming along with some other trainings and stuff. So keep tuned in. So what we're going to cover today is some conversion strategies, some technical conversion issues that I've seen, and some tools to help, and finally some Q&A. So again, this is basically things that I've learned from converting my own code and customers' code from the CRM 4.0 format to the 2011 plus format for both JavaScript and .NET. There's still a lot of that stuff out there. Even with the CRM Online, there's still a lot of things that are inside the system that you probably need to clean up. And as people kind of gear up to move to probably 2016, there's a lot of delay. There's still a lot of CRM 4 and even some CRM 3.0 stuff out there. So the upgrade path is, depending on where you start with, is going to be from CRM 3 to 4 to 2011 to 13 to 15 to 16. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is you can only move one step at a time. So if you're on 4.0 and you want to go to 2016, you're actually going to have to create 3 temporary servers in the middle to act as intermediaries to upgrade the system from one level to the next. So if you're starting off at 4.0, what you'll probably have to do is either create a copy of your 4.0 server or just take a backup of the database and then move it to the 2011 server and then upgrade that, move that to the 2013 server, to the 2015 server, and finally to the 2016 server. It's a lot of manual labor, but there's really no way around it at this point. So if you're pretty far behind, you're really just going to have to put some time and effort into catching up. That's just all there is to it. So let's talk about your development environment. One second. Excuse me. So the easiest way to do all these things is with a virtual machine setup. If you have that already set up for you, that's great. So what you do is you create one version of one virtual machine for every version of CRM that gets you from point A to point B. With your last and final version, it could actually be a new either virtual or physical machine for your CRM software, strictly because in most cases the server levels that you're running at are not going to be adequate for the new software. For instance, a lot of people are still running server 2008 either as a SQL or Windows. Those aren't supported anymore with the CRM 2016-15. So you're going to have to actually move up to the 2012 levels of the server and of SQL. So most of the time that's going to require extra hardware. So the end result is you're probably going to end up moving stuff anyway. So this is just kind of a step in the chain. So what you do is you create your virtual machines and then install CRM. A lot of times what you can do is for the intermediary machines, which are the ones here in the middle, sorry, you can just install CRM and SQL onto one box. So if you're on 4.0 and you have a 2011, 2013, 2015, and then finally you're going to 2016, the virtual machines in the middle, the 11, 13, and 15s, can all be on one box. So you put SQL and CRM on the box, you move the databases over, you upgrade, and then you repeat the process to the next server. So you don't actually have to install like a true production run. These are purely temporary machines. Don't forget that. So anyway, hang on one second, please. So what's interesting about the initial startup is you can take a copy of your existing environment, whether it be CRM 4.0 or 2011, whatever it might be, or you can work on your current production environment, because there's some cleanup that needs to be done at the server level, just to kind of prepare the database and get rid of the old records and things like that. So you may want to make a copy of your production environment as a secondary staging server and use that. And then what we're going to be doing, as I just mentioned, is we're going to be upgraded to the 2001X environment. And again, the number of servers that you're going to need for this is going to be totally dependent on how far back you're going. You're going to start it. You're starting, and how far forward you're going. A lot of people actually stopped at 2013 instead of going to 2015 because last fall they announced 2016, which should have been an upgrade of 2015. So what happened was it kind of freaked people out in a couple instances that I know of personally. And it's like, okay, well, we're not really sure where they're going with this, so we're going to stop at 13. And that's what they did. They stopped at 13, and then they were going to let kind of everything shake out with 2016, and then probably this year they'll go to 2016. So your number of servers involved is going to be totally dependent on where you start and where you're going. Come on. Okay, if you do not use source control, now would be a good time for you to start. I cannot emphasize this enough, and it doesn't matter if you're using JavaScript or .NET, either one. You're going to be making so many changes that you're going to have to be able to track those changes, because sooner or later you're going to screw something up that you didn't mean to. You over-edited, you consolidated when the consolidation was not appropriate, and you're going to have some method of rolling back to where you were. So you can get TFS for free for 5 users. It's just a Visual Studio Online. You can use Git. You can get a private repository for GitHub if you want. You can run your own internal. It doesn't matter. But whatever you do, you really need to use some kind of source control system. And I really just cannot emphasize that enough. That'll save your bacon, because there will be issues sooner or later. The other good thing is these have integrated issue tracking, so as you're going through your development upgrade process, you can actually track issues related to the code, and then you can have processes that guide the developers on upgrading the stuff. It really kind of depends on which product you go with as far as these latter two things go. So one of the really strange things, and I wanted to put this in there because this comes up more often than you would think, is do we really want to upgrade our CRM system? So you have to think about this. So Dynamics CRM 4.0, let's assume that everybody's starting off the 4.0. That shipped in 2007, into 2006, beginning of 2007. Okay, it's just 2016. So what's that, 9 years? Is that right? Something like that? So anyway, it's not 9 years. Sorry, I've got a cold, I can't think. The business that you had in 2007 is not the business that you have in 2016. Right? So a lot of times what happens is companies change, processes change, etc., and your CRM was probably adapted to those changes as well. So what happens is, in a lot of cases, you end up with a tremendous amount of stuff inside your CRM system that's totally irrelevant to the way that the company does business today. And that could be not only the data, but your all the stuff that you did to make the data work. So you have JavaScript, you have plugins, you have integration with legacy databases, you have all these things. So the big question is, do I really need this stuff in my CRM system, or do I just start from scratch? So this comes up more often than not. Like I said, people who have had systems for more than a handful of years, they will actually not do an upgrade. They will just take the data out by using Scribe or Kingsway Soft SSIS package to move the data, and they'll just start from scratch. It's like, okay, what do we do right now? How do we do stuff? And they will put into the CRM system the way that they do their business today, and then they move the data over, and then they start more or less with a fresh system. And that way they don't have to worry about doing code upgrades or anything like that. Because a lot of times, like I said, you have a lot of cruft in there that's just there. And so you just really need to kind of, pay attention to what you're doing there and just do what's best for the company. So let's start with JavaScript among the two things here. So the biggest conversion thing between 4.0 to 2011 is removing unsupported code. So we all did things that we had to do to make the job work, and most of it was unsupported, like hiding and showing things, believe it or not, was unsupported. So we have to remove all of that. We have to remove and change our web service calls because those are all different now. Now is a good time to make any architectural changes. Like I said, you're going to be spending a lot of time and money upgrading all your code. You need to make sure that what you're doing is what you want. And now is the time to do it. I've got a bunch of tips and tricks at that link there, and I'll send all these links out to everybody after the webinar, by the way. So now is the time to make all these changes because you're going to be in there working. You might as well fix the things that have always bothered you. That's the thing about it. The .NET code cleanup is more interesting, I think, than the JavaScript cleanup because there is a lot of code removal that has to be done. So they completely replace the object model for CRM with the SDK, the DLLs and stuff. I created a free tool up on Codeplex called the .NET Code Migrator that does basically, it's just a bunch of macros that does search and replaces, and we'll talk about this in a little bit to help you move all this code. But you've got a lot of code, depending on the level of customization of your system, you might have plugins, you have custom integration with other systems, you may have custom ASP.NET pages. A lot of, back in the day, we did a lot of that. So a lot of this stuff has to be upgraded strictly because the object model is 100% different. So let's get into the JavaScript here. So the first thing you have to do is upgrade the object model itself. So it's 100% different. Used to be CRM form, now it's XRM.page. There's a free converter tool that will convert most of the things. I have a commercial product called Transformer that will convert just about everything you can think of. I kind of categorize things in this manner here. So simple, difficult, tedious, hard, impossible, and then what the hell were they thinking? There's a lot of code that just cannot be converted because of the way it was written. A lot of people were, what I found, people who really knew what they were doing with JavaScript caused a lot of problems. People who didn't know what they were doing with JavaScript caused a lot of problems. The people in the middle you can fix. But the two outside edges, it's almost a complete rewrite because of the way things worked out. Always use Visual Studio to do this, and there's some tools I'll show you later to talk about that. But we get IntelliSense, we have code refactoring, we have source control. So once you get your JavaScript inside of Visual Studio, that's where you do all your editing, strictly because it's just much easier than trying to do it any other way. So one of the things that you do at the very beginning is you're going to kind of flatten out your function hierarchy. So the way that CRM 4.0 was written is most of the JavaScript was in individual events that were attached to the form itself. They were physically attached to the form, even in the database. So what happens is we put a lot of things in the onload event, and once they were loaded in the onload event, we had access to them everywhere else. So the problem is we have a lot of these functions that are literally inside of another function, which means they can't be referenced when you're anywhere else. When you upgrade your org to 2011, it will actually put everything into a web resource and then properly put things in the onload, on change events, on save, etc. So what you have to do is you have to take the information on the left-hand side and make it look like the layout on the right-hand side, which is basically just moving all the functions that were inside of the onload event function and pulling them at the same level as the onload event. And then here's a little bit of things I've talked about before, just the organization of your web resources. So generally we have one web resource per entity. And then I also like to move all of my ribbon code, so code that's used by buttons on the ribbon or anything else on the ribbon, I like to put that into a separate web resource strictly because I know what it's there for. I found that if you put your code that is used on buttons inside of your normal entity web resource, what happens is when you go to find out what does this function do, you can't find a reference for it, so you'll accidentally delete it, thinking that it was old code nobody used anymore, when in reality it was used by a ribbon, because there's no pointer to the ribbon, it just exists. So by putting them into its own web resource, you've kind of made a visual indicator of this is the code that's used by the ribbon, and you know what it's there for. Then you put generic or web or utility web resources, and then any tools like jQuery or JSON2 or the XRM Service Toolkit, things like that, into their own web resources. Excuse me. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that we did back in the day. So we in a lot of places, depending on the size of the organization, we would use external JavaScript files. So we'd actually put them into the ISV folder on premises inside the CRM web server and have one reference to that folder, and then pull the JavaScript files in with a bit of JavaScript and have them loaded there. So we only had one place to maintain those things. Again, totally unsupported, but that's what we had to do. So we have to import those and make those web resources. There's a lot of code that we just don't need anymore, strictly because CRM 2011 and above actually have methods built in to do all that stuff. So we can get rid of it. Also, during the upgrade process, you'll find CRM will actually generate a lot of empty methods. So you'll have like onload methods for forms, for iframes and stuff. They're totally empty. You can get rid of those because they don't actually point to anything. You'll find a lot of duplicate code too. So you'll have duplicate functions, as in functions that do exactly the same thing throughout the whole thing, like a format phone number. A lot of places you go, you'll find a format phone number in like 30 locations. Same function, same code. So that can be all pulled out into a central web resource, and then just all those deleted, and we can put it back, just referencing that one resource of function we created. So there's a lot of that going on. A lot of times what we would do is you have your event, and all it does is call a single function. So on the left-hand side, we have a series of on-change events. So these are basically, this actually came out of a customer organization. So what they did is they capitalized the first letter of every word is what they want to do on all the addresses and stuff like that. So they had this code on the left-hand side. Well, I can replace all that with just by pointing to the actual function and then passing a parameter into the function, as you see on the right-hand side. So that eliminated all the code on the left. The biggest problem you're going to get into is with SOAP calls. So everything that points to the 2007 endpoint has to be changed, because when you go to CRM 2013, if it sees anything pointing to the 40 endpoint or the 2007 endpoint, it will not upgrade the org. So you have to remove everything. So there's two free libraries out on Coplex. There's the XRM SVC toolkit and the XRM Service toolkit that provide all the SOAP and REST wrappers you need to write the code that does most of the stuff that you need. So a lot of that code can be eliminated and replaced with just calls to the XRM Service Toolkit libraries, and that'll just cut down a tremendous amount of code, because the SOAP calls are just nothing but a bunch of XML that you prepare and then send to the server. So you can, cut 100 lines of code down to like 5 or 10. There's a lot of unsupported code, and it really and truly depends on the level of knowledge of the person who created it. So as I mentioned earlier, people who were really good with JavaScript did a whole bunch of things with the object model, the DOM, as they say, document object model, that were totally unsupported, and that's just doesn't work in 2011 plus. As CRM is upgraded to 2013 and above, it works even less. Sometimes you can find ways around it, sometimes you can't. There's also browser-specific things that people did, so you have to kind of watch out for stuff like that. Other areas of concern are: do we have any ActiveX components? Are we tying into JavaScript on events like on click, on double click, etc.? Are we manipulating stuff in the DOM directly? Any 2007 SOAP endpoints, like I mentioned. Do we have any ribbon code? Do we need to review the functionality of everything we're doing? Do we have any manipulation of toolbar and menu items? So with 4.0, we had a toolbar and menu were the helpers at the top of the pages, and you could actually add buttons and menu items to those things. Well, that's no longer supported since we have the ribbon and later the command bar, and so you have to go back. Do you really need those things we added? Quite honestly, the answer in most cases is no. A lot of what we did in 4.0 was to add things that were built into 2011, like the ability to add activities to a record just by pushing a button. That's already there. So a lot of the code that we used for buttons and things like that can be totally discarded, and the remnants of that can be ignored as well. So anytime you're coding with JavaScript and CRM, you always have the decision to do code versus configuration. So a lot of what we did with hiding and showing stuff in the onload event can actually now be done through the configuration. So if you see code in the onload event that sets the visibility to false, which will basically hide something from the page, if you see that in the onload event, you need to replace that with the configuring the visible by default checkbox on the individual tab, section, or field. And the reason we do that is because it's faster. It's less code to maintain, but two, the way that they create the forms, that code is actually executed. The onload code is executed after the form has been painted. So what can happen is people can actually see a field appear on the form and then disappear when the JavaScript is run to told to hide it. So if you do it with configuration instead of code, it makes for a better user experience. It's faster and more visually appealing. The second thing that you can do is you can use code instead of configuration. So on the left-hand side, I have this on-change event for a phone call. And then on the right-hand side, you will see the function it's calling. And then below that, what you see is the same exact thing as on the left-hand side. So I'm using the add on-change event to add the on phone field change to the attribute telephone 1. So this is doing the same thing as the dialog box, but it's in code. I do this sometimes because it's easier to maintain if I have a lot of fields that have a lot of on-change events. This just helps me actually do things a little bit faster. So it's kind of up to you how you want to do things. But sometimes if you have a lot of events that have on-change methods, sometimes it's actually faster to put those on-change events in the onload event using the add-on change method instead of going and opening each one and configuring it with the configuration there in the event handler. So again, now is a chance for you to fix all of your architecture issues. I can't emphasize that enough. You're in there, screwing around with stuff and cleaning stuff up. And if you got any problems, now is the time to fix it. And there will be a lot of fixing. We have a lot of window.open that we use to display dialogues and stuff like that. So where possible, you can replace those with Open Entity Form or Open Web Resource. So those are pretty handy. You can also pass in parameters that would automatically populate fields if you didn't know that with the Open Entity Form. Another thing that is actually quite surprising is depending on the state of your system, you may end up with a lot of web resources that are not used. So I find this a lot with people who did a lot of development was starting with 2011. If they had a lot of developers in there, a lot of times what happens, and depending on how they use the solution model, you would end up with a lot of web resources that weren't being used. So I had one installation, we had about 14,000 lines of code, and I spent about a month modifying, cleaning stuff up, and I realized that about 50% of what I was working on wasn't even in use anymore. And you find that out by opening up the default solution, looking at your web resource, and clicking on the Show Dependencies button. It'll actually pop up a box that will show you where it's being used. And I just did that one night, and it was like, it was resource after resource I did it on, and nothing showed up. And I'm like, oh my God, I've been working on this stuff for a month, and these things aren't even being used because people just didn't delete them. Minification is a process where it removes all the comments and all the punctuation, like all the hard returns and things like that, and it changes all the variable names to smaller names. This is partly a security thing, but also it reduces the amount of code that's being downloaded in a chunk. That's what Microsoft does with all their code, so that the everything loads faster because it's a smaller code base. You can do this if you have a large code base, but the problem is it makes debugging really difficult because the code that's being executed is not the code you normally work with. So what will happen is you'll have the code is, I'm not going to say it's unreadable, but it's really, really close to being unreadable. So when you have issues like that, it's hard to track down what the problem is. So most of the time, for most enterprise clients, this is not a big deal. But if you do have a lot of code, you might want to consider minification. But again, you have to do lots and lots of testing to make sure you don't have any problems. Oops, sorry. All right, hang on 1 second, please. Okay, so testing is absolutely the best thing that you can do when you're doing all stuff. So, test with real users, test with real data, test with actual processes. Make sure your email router is turned off or your server-side sync is not turned on, so that you don't start sending emails out accidentally. But just, when you get through with all your upgrades and stuff like that, you really need to make sure you're testing everything. Okay, let's get into some .NET stuff. Okay, so I spent a good bit of time upgrading several different installations, and here's kind of what I came up with. So we have these major groups of things that we convert. So we have CRM data types, some main keywords, plugin keywords, and then we have some changes in the way the entity and field names are referenced within either CRM 4.0 or above. So some examples of that, get into in a minute, but the biggest thing is the 4.0 object model and below, 3 and 4, was very verbose. They had to do a lot of stuff, a lot of times based on the level of .NET they started with. So we had a big problem. They started with .NET 1.1 eons ago, and as I understand it, it didn't support null data types. Well, at some point in time, you have to blank out a value in a database. So to get around that, they had to create these complex data types that wrap normal data types like Boolean or numbers and stuff like that. So all of that has to be replaced with just the normal data types that .NET uses now. So there's lots of room for code improvement. There's tons of things that you can actually remove, and I mean just literally tons of things. You get to take advantage of the enhancements to .NET 4. We're on like 4.5.2 now. The SDK has changed dramatically over the years, so it's now much easier to do things with less code. So all this code conversion is really going to show up like that. Here's part of the macro system I developed to do the conversions. Here is an example of what we're actually converting. So the stuff on the left-hand side is what we're converting from, and then what we're converting to. So things like CRM money property converts to a money, CRM money converts to a new money, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the kind of things. So these, the first group there is straight to text conversion. The second group uses a regex value to do stuff. But this is the kind of thing we're actually converting from and to. So again, it's a lot of manual labor. So the macro system that I created for this allows you to actually upgrade the code. And the problem with this is they dropped the macro system in Visual Studio 2012. Now they've added it back, but the problem is it's added back as JavaScript. This is VB script. Okay. So what this means is you have to actually load your projects in Visual Studio 2010 in order to actually use these macros. But quite honestly, the amount of time you'll save for running these macros versus doing it by hand is astronomical. I mean, I can't tell you how much time it saved me. The way I create these macros is I would create them, I would open the file up and just run them manually one after the other, and then fix everything up that was either broken by the conversion process or it was left over, and just do it one at a time. And once I get all the things converted, then I would upgrade the project to Visual Studio 2013 or 2015 and continue the process from there. That's how that really works. Some of the main keywords, all the using statements changed, and then the things, all the kind of common things, everything from the organizational service to what they call the business entities changed. So pretty much, like I said, it's almost 100% changed in the way they did stuff. So everything has to be rewritten. The .NET stuff is actually kind of more of it's easier to kind of upgrade because the macros and stuff that I have, and the value you get from changing all your code and eliminating a bunch of stuff is really, really high. But a lot of people don't ever talk about that for some reason. Plugins are about the same. There's a lot of things in either plugins or custom workflow activities that change just names because they change the names of the underlying systems. And then finally, all of the logical names change. So the way that CRM 4.0 referenced things and the way that CRM 2011 Plus referenced things change. So one of the tools that's in the .NET Code Migrator is a tool where you point it at the organization and it will generate a series of macros that will do search and create macros that will do search and replace operations for the entity names and finally the attribute logical names, because like I said, they're all different. So you run the tool, it generates the code, then you import that code into Visual Studio, and then you run it against the stuff, and it goes and changes everything. And like I said, it's just repetition. It's kind of it's kind of a pain in the butt to do, but you don't have to do it once. And once you get everything upgraded to the 2011 model, it all works forward. So what's all this mean? Well, it's a lot of reduced code, reduced maintenance since you have fewer code, faster user experience. Like I said, you're in here doing stuff, so now is the time to check to see what in the world you have going on inside your system. Okay? I think you're going to find there's a lot of weird stuff in there. A lot of stuff you don't need anymore because CRM does things by itself better than you did. So a lot of code can be taken out. So here are 3 real customer upgrades I did. So I did 49% code reduction on the first one, 30% on the second one, 50% on the third one. So that's both JavaScript and .NET. So, I mean, if you think about it, having half the code to maintain that you started with, I think is a win for everybody. And again, here's that link to some of the tips that I have from going 4.0 to 2011. So some of the tools that I use are the XRM Toolbox. It's by Tonki, one of the other MVPs out of France. The XRM Service Toolkit and the XRM Service Toolkit are on Codeplex. I use ReSharper. I'm a big fan of ReSharper because it helps you rewrite your code and tells you where you made stupid mistakes, and I just love that. There was a tool called CRM Solution Manager. They just renamed it to XRM. Toolkit. XRM Toolkit. I wish he'd chosen a different name because it's really too close to Toolbox. But this is an add-in for Visual Studio that allows you to connect to CRM to pull things out and push things back in. So it's for editing your JavaScript and creating plugins and stuff like that. So that's a really cool tool. I use that all the time myself. And then finally, my JavaScript conversion tool, Transformers, at the bottom here. Okay. So what did I miss? That's a whole lot of stuff there. So do you have any comments? Nothing? Aaron says you told them that the XRM toolkit was a name problem. Yeah. As soon as I saw he did that, I was like, oh, Steve, man, I wish you would have done that. So I know that was kind of quick, so no questions at all? Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions, then I really appreciate the time today. And like I said, I'll have this up on YouTube. I'll try to get it up before I go out of town today. And as always, I really appreciate you taking the time out of the day. So let me know if you have any questions.